My name is Ottaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. This is the second of a series of short videos dealing with subjects covered in my recent book, Climbing the High Ladder: Development in the Global Economy. Today, the topic is China's economic rebalancing. In the previous discussion on trade globalization, I highlighted the weight of China in the process during its unfolding in the 90s and 2000s, but also as China started its rebalancing in the 2000s. And indeed, this chart shows China's GDP growth rates, annual rates, in the last few decades, often reaching 2 digits. And that explains why in the World Bank's classification of countries according to per capita income, the country moved from low income levels to an upper middle income level. It all started with President Deng Xiaoping's reforms, allowing the free operation in special zones of foreign investors hiring local labor to produce and export goods under conditions of what one might call wild capitalism. China became a major component of the tectonic plate shift in the global economy that we approached in the first video, you may recall, resulting from a cheap labor supply expansion in the global market economy, together with the fragmentation of manufacturing processes and trade policy opening. Income growth and poverty reduction accompanied the extraordinary expansion of local manufacturing activity in China. By the beginning of last decade, though, it became clear that China's growth trajectory would inevitably change and that the era of frequent 2-digit growth rates had ended. That's when the expression China's rebalancing came to life. I personally heard it from then President Hu Jintao in a ceremony at the Hall of People in 2011. And you can see in the chart how GDP growth rates gradually slowed down in the following years until reaching 6% in 2019. Obviously, 2020 was a point out of the curve because of the pandemic. Now, before addressing why and where the rebalancing of China's economy had to take place, let's just give a look at the effects of the pandemic. I am using there the IMF trajectories for GDP presented in the World Economic Outlook released in January 2021. And the dotted lines here are the GDP trajectories forecast by the World Economic Outlook of the IMF back in January of last year. And then the other ones show the new ones, reflecting the coronavirus. As you can see, China was the first in, first out case, and with a V-shaped recovery. But I note that even China, with that performance, will not escape unscathed from the coronavirus crisis, as to the least, the underperformance of the rest of the world will weigh down on its exports. But in any case, as you can see on the right hand side, no region has escaped from the coronavirus in the sense that the GDP some GDP will be lost over the following years vis-a-vis the trajectory before. But okay, why and where to China's economic rebalancing was inevitable? Look, and see, the Chinese pattern of rapid growth with a structural change of the decades prior to the 2010s had been accompanied by rising economic imbalance, while the main pillars of growth seem to be poised to gradually weaken. Former Premier Wen Jiabao said in 2007 that the country's economic growth trajectory was, quote, unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable, end quote. And why is that? High and sustained GDP growth rates were based on elevated investment to GDP ratios, which were only possible with low shares of wage income and domestic consumption, as well as with cheap and repressed finance. Another complementary factor was dynamic markets abroad, willing and capable of absorbing an expansion of Chinese exports, something that could not be taken for indefinite, given the size acquired by China's economy. So the combination of high investment and low domestic consumption, a flip side of high profits relative to wage, was only possible because of current account surpluses in trading with the rest of the world. So growing income disparities were a domestic flip side of that model, a potential source of social strain along with changes in the external environment to the Chinese economy. And three mutually reinforcing paths of transformation were seen ahead in 2011, including a structural slowdown of growth on the cards. First, China had accrued large productivity increases through transferring resources from low productivity agricultural activities to industry, a typical feature of economies moving from low to middle income levels, the subject of future videos in this series. Those gains had, to a large extent, already happened. On the demographic front, the old age dependency ratio had started to rise. Gains in economic efficiency and technological progress based on absorption of existing imported technologies would have to be increasingly replaced with local innovation. But the set of second-generation policy reforms necessary for that would require time, whereas low-hanging fruits in terms of productivity increase would be less available. A second path of change, a rebalance in the sector structure and in the aggregate demand composition was expected. Higher shares of service and consumption, following rising wages, with a decrease in exports, savings, and investment ratios to GDP, should accompany the increased reliance on domestic source of aggregate demand. The income gap between coastal areas, where the special zones were created and extended, and the middle and western regions should fall as the labor pool shrink. Despite lower GDP growth rates due to lower investment to GDP ratios and total factor productivity increase harder to obtain, the popular perception of rising prosperity would probably be higher than before, with rising purchasing power by the population. Now, the third path of structural transformation would be a shift up the value chain in tradable and non-tradable activities. And that should underpin the paths of change in the sector structure and in components of aggregate demand. And a transition to more sophisticated production processes was already being pursued at the time. So while moving to a less spectacular growth trajectory, China would be morphing into a mass consumer market economy combined with supply capacity increasingly reliant on growth of total factor productivity. But having a clear roadmap did not mean any easy ride. The chart shows the ongoing structural transformation of the Chinese economy. And in this video, as you will see, I strongly benefited from the latest IMF annual report on China released in January, from which I'm taking most of these charts. But look, the left-hand panel depicts how domestic demand has been shifting away from investment and towards consumption as Chinese households become wealthier and their disposable income rise. Second, on the right-hand panel, dealing with the production side, we can see that services are outgrowing manufacturing as the structure of production becomes more complex, integrated, and with higher value added. However, and that's a challenge. The transition toward less investment in export-dependent growth model has been taking place from a starting point of exceptionally low consumption to GDP ratios as compared to the rest of the world. No wonder rebalancing towards a consumption-based growth model was expected to be only gradually pursued, as GDP growth rates might collapse rather than slide down. The change of growth pattern would require time-intensive structural reforms. And as you can see on the left-hand side of this chart, the transition with respect to current account surpluses has been taking place. It shows the diminishing role played by current account surpluses with the rest of the world as part of China's growth rebalancing. 2020 has also been a point of the curve here. The current account surplus of China narrowed in the first quarter of last year, but widened again to 1.5% of GDP over the 4 quarters ending in the third quarter, reflecting a stronger trade balance and also the collapse in outbound tourism by Chinese. Exports have been strong, led by a surge in demand for personal protection equipment and consumer electronics and favorable price. The right-hand panel also shows how rebalancing towards consumption regressed as public investment drove the 2020 recovery, and the reopening after the first quarter lockdown favored industrial activity. Now, but there is another important point to be highlighted with respect to the rebalancing, which is the one about the public social networks, the social safety nets in China. See, besides the high profit to wage ratios, low levels of public social spending in China lead to high household savings. So strengthening social safety nets and public spending on health and education might help rebalancing towards the domestic mass consumption model. And by the way, that would reinforce the domestic side of the dual circulation strategy, so much emphasized in the recent China's 14th five-year plan. Social safety nets remain indeed inadequate in China. As you can see on the left-hand panel, the coverage of the unemployment insurance system is still extremely limited, providing coverage for only 1 in 3 people in the urban labor force and for fewer than 1 in 5 migrant workers. Coverage is even thinner in rural areas. As you can see, only 10% of 23 million unemployed workers received benefits in 2016. So a combination of a permanent strengthening of the social safety net with reforms like broadening the tax base and increasing its progressivity would provide effective household support. Spending on social assistance and public health care is low in China. China's aggregate welfare and health expenditures are only about 3.5% of GDP, even considering a recent uptick. That's much less than the average of more than 6% of GDP for other emerging market economies. And indeed, as you can see, social assistance spending in China in percent of GDP is quite low. And you see the absence of many of the existing items that one may find in their peers. And obviously, reinforcing those items might persuade Chinese to save less, and so make them move towards the mass consumption economy faster. Now, it's important to highlight also some other kind of challenge that the rebalancing has faced, particularly on the financial side. Look, fears about a possible collapse of the global economy in the aftermath of the global financial crisis were followed by countercyclical policies everywhere. In the case of China, a great quantitative easing, one might call it, took the form of a combination of shadow banking, parallel banking if you want, and capital expenditure on housing and infrastructure, with a high role played by special purpose vehicles, SPVs, associated with subnational entities. The left-hand side of the chart shows the increase of off-budget quasi-fiscal activities after the global financial crisis. Lending by non-bank entities through shadow finance accounted for about 2/5 of new credit by 2016. So China's economic policies, although instrumental to sustaining the smoothness of the growth downslide that we saw in the first chart, could not avoid becoming source of concern. The first is that the attainment of official target growth rates along the gradual slide down of growth has been accompanied by overcapacity in some heavy industry and construction sectors, as well as increasing debt leverage of corporates and households. And by the way, the Belt and Road Initiative that we mentioned in the previous video might be of help in that regard. Anyway, Chinese authorities have alternated measures to dampen such debt trajectory before vulnerability to a sudden stop reaches any critical point, with periodic loosening of fiscal, monetary, and financial restrictions to avoid drastic declines in growth rates. So waves of credit-driven overinvestments in infrastructure and housing after the global financial crisis helped sustain growth and smooth the decline. But there has been a clear perception of a declining effectiveness of such a lever. The motivations of tackling financial risk and avoiding a sharp growth slowdown have been pursued with policy tuning via target measures of tax cuts, de-risking, and regulatory change. A difficulty stems from decreasing returns in terms of additional output obtained with the maintenance of high investments and debt accumulation. China's public capital stock per head exceeds those of comparable economies. Residential and infrastructure investments increase dramatically, and export-led growth faces rising challenges. In any case, over the decade, China thwarted incoming financial disruption and retains sufficient fiscal space and foreign reserves to implement any official bailouts that may be needed. And that helps understand why so many calls for an imminent financial collapse by some analysts have failed. On the other hand, avoiding a deeper growth downslide by maintaining policies in place tends to become more difficult, with decreasing returns from investment come debt at the margin. With increasing amount of capital investment needed to yield incremental units of output, for China to hold steady would require ever increasing levels of debt. Again, we look at 2020 on the right-hand panel. And as we can see, private sector debt has increased significantly, in particular among corporates. Corporate debt is expected to have risen by about 10 percentage points to 127% of GDP last year, following a decline of roughly the same magnitude over the previous 3 years. Household debt is expected to have increased by 2 percentage points. Another challenge is the one with respect to the rebalancing of state-owned enterprise and private-owned enterprise. Look, back in 2011, Chinese authorities referred to this as part of a rebalance between public and private sectors, the reforms of the SOEs to boost private sector growth and competition. But that has stalled. Progress in reforming the SOEs has seen limited progress. credit is still preferentially channeled to state business, which enjoy implicit guarantees, and competition between private firms and state-owned enterprise remains uneven in sectors where these SOEs were thought to open space. While large state-owned banks keep lending to SOEs, infrastructure and real estate investments are supported by shadow finance. SOE deleveraging has paused, reflecting in part the pandemic crisis and the resort to them to support growth. That may have been an extraordinary policy option, to be seen. What matters here is to call attention to the fact that the performance indicators shown on the left side of the chart suggest that the absence of significant reform of state-owned businesses has come at a cost in terms of productivity and real returns foregone. According to the IMF report, even among listed firms, the average productivity gap between SOEs and private enterprise across sectors in China is about 20%. The right-hand panel shows how that would be important. China has seen remarkable growth over the last decades, but average sectoral productivity yet remains at about 1/3 of the global frontier. Productivity gaps are especially large in the service sector. For example, business service productivity stands at only 17% of the frontier level, to a large extent because of high entry barriers. Reforms addressing these gaps would include further opening up non-strategic sectors, such as service, to the entry of new private firms, both domestic and foreign. Also, removing regional regulatory barriers would also increase competition and improve factor allocation by facilitating firm entry and mobility across regions in all sectors. See, those productivity gaps have significant implications for the level of GDP, considering the state-owned enterprise sector's dominance in the use of resource. The IMF Article 4 refers to a staff analysis suggesting that reforms closing productivity gaps between SOEs and POEs, private-owned enterprise, across sectors, could raise output by around 4% over the medium to the longer term. So, to summarize, China's growth trajectory in the second decade of the century has been one of rebalancing toward a new growth pattern, one in which domestic consumption is to rise relative to investment and exports, while a drive toward consolidating local insertion up the ladder of value added in global value chains also takes place. Service should also keep rising relative to manufacturing. Declining GDP growth rates from 2 digits in the previous decades to 6% in 2019, and even lower ahead, most likely, would be the counterpart to rising wage and domestic mass consumption, and to the transition toward higher weights of service and high tech. We pointed out 2 major challenges in the rebalancing. First, the transition towards less investment in export-dependent growth model has been taking place from our starting point of exceptionally low consumption to GDP ratios. Besides high profit to wage ratios, low levels of public social protection and spending lead to high household savings. And an additional challenge comes from the lack of progress in rebalancing between private and state-owned enterprise, something that is taking a toll on productivity. Well, other major challenges have more to do with the trade and technology sides. In this regard, of course, the US-China rivalry comes to the fore, but that will be the subject for another video. The content of this video is further developed in chapter 13 of my book that you can find on those places listed on the slide. Reading the IMF annual report would also be advisable. The next video of this series will approach the connections attributed to exist between trade globalization and global income inequality. Stay tuned.